Okay. All right. So initially, if you remember the schedule, we were going to talk about infused virtues, theological virtues today, but kind of after our discussion last week, I decided that we'd actually talk about mental prayer. The reason being, I think, because the what I really want you all to do is by the end of this semester to have a habit of prayer, right? And to actually know what you're doing and to be able to just sort of have it so ingrained that your entire life begins to center around your prayer. Remember, I talked about that a little bit last week about how we have to begin to think about like, okay, what effect does what I'm doing have on my prayer life, right? So I don't go to bed on time. I get up and I'm tired and I don't pray very well, or I binge watch on YouTube and I'm so easily distracted. So that's what I kind of want to do is that it gets to be in a certain place in your life where it's so important that it becomes the center of your life. And I promise if you do that, especially do it now, your life will be totally different. I don't, I don't think there's any hyperbole in saying that. Your life will be totally different. So what I want to do is just go through sort of the justification for mental prayer, why you start there, and then go through the mechanics of it, right? So that as you begin to grow in prayer, you can kind of troubleshoot what's going on a little bit too. Okay. All right. So that's the goal. So what I want to do is just start again. We'll start kind of high level and then begin to hone in. And by the end, we'll talk about very specific aspects of it. So we'll start with the definition. And pretty much when it comes to prayer, there's about as many definitions as there are, I guess, people who write books about prayer. So the prayer is the lifting up of our minds and hearts to God, to adore him, to thank him for his benefits, to ask forgiveness, and and to be, or to ask him, sorry, I don't know why it says to ask him all the graces we need, whether for soul or body. All right, so those three elements of prayer, which we've talked about before: adoration, thanksgiving, forgiveness, and petition, right? What I want you to begin to think about, though, is think of prayer as an expression of desire and petition. All right, because in a certain sense, all of those fit in petition, right? Because you're asking God for something good, right? And in adoring him, you're asking him for something good, right? You're asking for his goodness to be further revealed to you. So I want, because the reason being, right, Jesus gives us two virtues of his to follow. What two are they? Well, virtues, not commandments, virtues. I mean, all the virtues Jesus like displays, yeah. Learn from me, I am meekness and humble of heart, right? And so when our disposition of being able to see everything coming from God, when we get in the habit of doing that, that's when we begin to receive everything from God, right? So we often get in our own way. And so if we begin to think about, I'm completely and totally needy, and I need God to give me even the grace to pray, then we're in a disposition to receive everything that he wants to give us. Okay. So continue to keep that in mind as we go through, and it'll be one of the things we do when we start sort of prepare for prayer, is to remind ourselves who God is and who we are. Okay. All right. So those four things again, really just all kind of fit in petition, and that raising or the lifting up of our minds and our hearts to God. Okay. And so, um, what's the first thing? Does anyone remember last week? What's the first thing that God purifies in you, right, of your powers? You remember? It's your intellect, right? Because it's your highest. So God is spirit, right? And how do spirits connect? On the intellectual level, right? Like angels talk to each other by sharing ideas, right? And so our intellect is our highest faculty. It's the thing that God purifies first, right? Because, and we're going to say this about 100 times today, we don't think about reality correctly, right? And we need God to tell us how reality really is. All right. And part of that is now going to God and for him to sort of explain reality to us about how things really are. Well, part of original sin, right, is darkness of the intellect. So just think in those terms, right? But we also don't think about God correctly either, right? Like we need him to tell us about him because there's things we can't know about God, right? Like And remember, I think last week we used the definition of faith was the habit of thinking like God thinks, right? And so faith, essentially, the theological virtue of faith is God sharing his knowledge of himself with us. And then faith would be trusting that what he reveals to us is actually true, right? Because he can neither deceive nor be deceived. Okay, so definition, what I want you to just think about is before our hearts are purified, our minds have to be purified. Okay, so we have to be able to think clearly about reality. We have to see reality. We have to see God more clearly before our desires get untwisted. All right, and so what I want to start with then is we'll sort of talk about what role vocal prayer plays. Okay, Catechism says vocal prayer is an essential element of the Christian life. To his disciples, drawn by their master's silent prayer. So it's talking about, the scene in the Gospels where it's in Luke's Gospel specifically. So if you want to meditate on Jesus praying, there's about 4 or 5 places in Luke's Gospel where he does it. And one of the times the apostles kind of catch him and they ask him, like, teach us how to pray. And he doesn't give them, like a whole school of like, okay, here, sit here, do this, do that. He gives them the Our Father. Right? Why do you think he does that? In what way, Victor?
Like like who are you addressing the prayer to? What are you asking for? In what way do you do it? What's how how?
Okay. What were you gonna say, Pete? It's something they're capable of understanding at that moment. I mean, yeah. So so it's on a level that they can understand, right? So it's an entry, right? Entry into prayer, and it has all of the elements that we're going to talk about, right? So who are they addressing? Like they're, our Father who art in heaven, right? And that what do? They adore him. Hallowed be thy name, right? Thy kingdom come. Right? And then what do they want to do? They want to do whatever he wants to do. Thy will be done, right? And so the basis of prayer is kind of packed in and baked in to the Our Father. All right. The other reason, okay, so he not only prayed aloud the liturgical prayers of the synagogue, but as the Gospels show, he raised his voice to express his personal prayer from exultant blessing of the Father to the agony of Gethsemane. So there's a tendency to think that we have to be like super creative in our vocal prayers, right? Like, I think it's kind of like a little bit of like a Protestantization that kind of sneaks in. But what are the best vocal prayers besides the Our Father? I mean, the Rosary is good, yes. Yeah, the Hail Mary is good. Glory be is good. The Jesus prayers. Everyone know what the Jesus prayers? You mentioned that last week too. Does everyone know what that is? Yes. Say that again. Yeah, the Saint Michael prayer. How about the Psalms? Yeah. So in a lot of ways, right, the Psalms are the perfect prayers, right? Well, one, because they're revealed to us. But if you read them and if you actually sort of, and we'll talk more about this when we talk about praying with scripture, what ultimately is being revealed there is like every dimension of the human heart in their discussion with God, right? This is why you see it. You see our Lord, they're on his lips all the time, right? And so don't be shy to pray vocal prayers. It's not elementary, because ultimately what the purpose of them are, right? When we think about something, usually our words follow, right? But in this case, the words of what we should be thinking come first, right? And so what we can do is we shape our heart, and they have this effect because they're the word of God and they form us, right? That our minds begin to be shaped by what we say, right? Especially if we're attentive to them, right? So that's why vocal prayers are the sort of the entry into prayer, right? You can't skip over them. And I don't care what level of prayer you get to, you will still use them. And so the point is, at first, it teaches us the right things to desire. And then as our hearts begin to grasp onto them, it actually changes what we desire. Okay. And so the Psalms really good. Like I said, if you go into them, you will find pretty much any situation you're in matches to a song, right? And it essentially tells you how to go to God in those situations. And that's exactly why they were written. Okay. All right. So now moving towards, so vocal prayer is considered sort of the first level of prayer. Okay. And it's not like you graduate from vocal prayer and then kind of move on to mental prayer, but vocal prayer is something that everybody does. Yes, Pat. Um, yes. I mean, so the liturgy, in a certain sense, yes, would be, right? But it has other element, like the other elements of prayer in there too, right? But yes, at the very least, it's a vocal prayer. Okay, so moving in the direction of sort of getting where we're growing in prayer, and we run into what St. Alphonsus Liguori says, and he says, all the saints have become saints by mental prayer. All right, and another place he says, without mental prayer, you'll be damned. I didn't put that one up there. But why? Why is that true? Why? So that universally, every saint has practiced mental prayer. Why? Yeah, certainly without like regularly finding out what God wants, you end up going down rabbit holes. Yes. So, like to say something, but not to not actually think of it in the way it's lying. Okay. All right. So Corinne just put a chat in here and she said, because it heightens the intellect. Right. What did I say was the very first thing that's purified? Right. Our intellect, right? Because again, we have to think correctly before we can do things correctly. All right. So um, so what it ultimately comes down to, right, is the process of conversion starts with mental prayer. Okay. The process of conversion starts with mental prayer because we have to, in a certain sense, and we'll come back to this, right? Be transformed by the renewal of your mind. Right. And that's not just like change your mind, start thinking differently, right? We can't do that. Can't do that on our own. Right. And the other piece that makes mental prayer really important, right, is it's hard. Right. It's hard. And we have to put a lot of effort into it. And by doing that, right, um, it teaches us how to be more and more receptive to God. And that's how we enter into sort of the higher levels of prayer. Okay, so let's sort of dive in a little further before we get into the mechanics. All right, meditation is above all, this is again from the Catechism, meditation is above all a quest. The mind seeks to understand the why and how of the Christian life in order to adhere and respond to what the Lord is asking. The required attentiveness is difficult to sustain. We are usually helped by books, and Christians do not want for them the sacred scriptures, particularly the Gospels, holy icons, liturgical texts of the day or season, writings of the spiritual fathers, works of spirituality, the great book of creation, and that of history, the page on which today of God is written. Okay, so think of meditation as this habit of think of like a bee. What does a bee do before it like goes and gets the pollen? Does anyone know? Like anyone ever watched a bee or like over a flower? Like does it just dive right in? Yeah, well, it just kind of hovers over it, right? It just kind of hovers over it. Um, yeah, in a certain sense, it's checking it out. And like at the heart of meditation is hovering over what you're meditating on. All right. It's hovering, staying there, right? Until you find some pollen you want to go get, right? Until you can sort of get at the sweet spot. The other thing too, that I would just want to keep in mind, I think I said this already, but if I didn't, I should have. The value in mental prayer ultimately is not the sort of the ruminations we have about God. It's not the ideas we come up with, right? It's what it moves in us, right? So we'll call them affections. What it moves us, what it ultimately we want to do is move towards God, right? So, I'm meditating on I don't know, the Our Father, right? And I'm hovering over it and I'm letting the words sort of soak into my heart. And I realize, I'm not a very forgiving person, right? And, in order to be like Jesus, I've got to forgive. And so what do? I have to stay there and I have to ask God to heal my heart, right? And eventually, right, what he's going to do first is he's going to maybe I don't even value, maybe I think, well, you know what, it's not that big a deal, right? Like sometimes people are really jerks and they kind of just deserve it, right? And then so what happens, right, in meditation, it first has to become a conviction, right, before it really ever enters into your heart. And that's why we stay on it for so long, right? And so when you come across something when you're meditating and it's not a conviction, first ask for the grace to be convicted. But just understand, again, that's where you open up to God and let him heal, right? And that's where you open up to God and tell him, I want to be like Jesus. I want this, but I don't think I really want it bad enough. Right. And again, remember the example that I used last week where the apostle said, where he tells the apostles if they have faith the size of a mustard seed, they can move a mountain, right? And what do? They're like, well, I don't have faith like that. They ask him for the faith, right? So early in mental prayer, and there's no real timetable, but early on, it's really about forming convictions, right? About that you really want the Christian life, right? You have to decide that. That's where you decide, right? And the thing is, the reason why you go into prayer to do this is it's not you doing it all on your own, right? What God's going to do over time is change your heart, right? Because he wants to spend time with you, right? And he wants to heal you and he wants to make you look just like Jesus. But that's not an instantaneous thing. It's not a decision. It's not an altar call. It's none of those things, right? My heart has to slowly, and of course, there's times when, you might be wrestling with something and God just convicts you like that, right? It happens, I mean, literally all the time, but that's not the norm that happens, right? And so we just have to understand if you're not convicted, like that's what you take into prayer. If there's something you're not convicted about, that's where you start. Okay. And that's what meditation is for, because you begin to see the value of it, right? You begin to see how it fits into the Christian life. You begin to see that it's indispensable, right? So, Jesus says, I'm meek and humble at heart. I don't really think meekness is that important, right? Well, I got to have a change of heart. And that change of heart can only happen when I could become convicted that meekness is the way. And that conviction only comes with grace. Okay. So that's why we hover over it. Yes, Victor. Yeah. Ask me again when we're sort of in the example and I'll in the examples. Okay. All right. So now moving towards what does mental prayer look like? All right. So do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewal of your minds, so that you may discern what is the will of God, what is good, acceptable, and perfect. What is St. Paul talking about here? In a certain sense, yes, right? Allow yourself to be transformed by the renewal of your mind, right? So what begins to happen, right? And the purpose of mental prayer is to change our outlook, right? We have a natural outlook, even if we're optimistic, we have a natural outlook on life, right? Like, okay, like I know all these things are good, and I want to be naturally good, right? But what needs to happen to become a saint is you have to have a supernatural outlook, right? And so what has to happen is our way of seeing and thinking about the world has to be transformed, right? It's not fundamentally like the problem isn't fundamentally that we're broken. The problem is that we're natural, like what we're given is a supernatural thing we know nothing about, right? Like remember that what God is offering us is not just like, oh yeah, you're going to be really good and perfect, you'll be the perfect human being. What he's offering us is divine sonship, right? And so he has to teach us what it's like to share in the divine life. And then, of course, like I said last week, like there's lots of garbage in my life that I have to get out of the way in order for that to happen. But even still, that's not something that naturally comes to me, right? Um, so what we're trying to do is let our minds be transformed so that our heart now desires the things that are actually supernaturally good for us. Okay. Yes, April. Yeah, ultimately, like one of the goals of mental prayer, and this is why it's like foundational, is and we can talk about this now. I was going to talk about it later, but when I say recollection, does anyone do you know what that means? When I say be recollected? Yeah, and it yeah, go ahead. In a certain sense, right? It's recollected just means I can take my faculties and use them how I want to use them. Right. Remember last week I said, like, okay, a lot of times memory, imagination get, are sort of run away on us, right? Yeah. Yeah. So recollection is essentially us being able to use our faculties sort of on command. So to be able to think about something clearly without getting distracted, to be able to see the good and to want the good, right? And what happens, right? Like that's how, in a certain sense, you pray always is something happens and I'm just able to, and this is why the examine is important. And to answer your question, April, I don't know what I would like kind of categorize it as, but it's an element in like in a prayer life that essentially helps us to pray always. Um, and so what ultimately happens, right, as you get better at it, your memory and your imagination, you're able to control them, right? And you can pray at any point, like any point during the day, right? Like something happens, you're like, I need to pray about this. And you can immediately kind of call your faculties and you have control over them. You're not anxious, you're not distracted, you're not right. And that's the ultimate goal, right? So think about like the example always is like Our Lady, what does she do every time something happens? She ponders it in her heart, right? She ponders that's recollection. Okay. And that's ultimately what our goal is. And that's why you never put this aside, right? Because she's always able to just to think about and then to desire whatever God wants, right? She's like, okay, I understand the meaning now where Christ, where he was lost in the temple for 3 days. I want what God wants. Okay. All right. So this idea then, so like a perfect example of what happens to us, right? So I'll use the example of the road to Emmaus, right? So think of the road to Emmaus, the whole sort of event as prayer. All right. So who is it that initiates prayer? God does, right? In this case, Jesus comes to uh, comes to them when they're walking on the road. And what does he do? Well, in a certain sense, he invites them. Like he's like, what's been going on? As if he doesn't know, right? He invites them to share what's on their hearts, right? And what do? Again, it's at that level of desire, right? They express disappointment. They're like, we thought this was the one, right? And then so he enters into this sort of intimate dialogue with them. And then what does he do? He opens their minds to the scriptures, right? And in this case, he gives them everything all at once, right? But that's the same thing that happens to us in prayer, right? And then what happens? Huh? Yeah, well, in between that, though, they desire to stay with him, right? So what happened? Their desire wasn't for more information, their desire was for him, right? And then because they encountered him in a real way, what did they do? They recognized him in the Eucharist. But that's that's the growth pattern you're looking for, right? It's all in one place, but that's the growth pattern you're looking for, right? If you want to have a greater devotion to Jesus in the Eucharist, that's how you get it, right? Because as you begin to hear his voice and begin to spend time with him, you will recognize him even more deeply, right? So now we just make acts of faith, right? But it's still it ends up being sort of a little unreal in the sense of like we're like I just don't like I know that's really Jesus there, but it doesn't feel real, right? Well, it only feels real when you really know Jesus, right? And then you begin to see him where he really is, right? Um, okay, so that pattern of ever deepening, that's what we're doing each time we enter into prayer, right? We're like the disciples on the road to Emmaus, where God normally slowly opens our minds, right? And when he does that, we have this innate desire for him, right? Not more facts about him, but the desire is for him. Any questions on that? Okay, so I think I've already sort of talked about this. But ultimately, like I said, when our goal initially is to form convictions, and ultimately what you want to do is form the conviction that Jesus is the way, the truth, and the life. All right. If I just nail it down to one thing, right? One thing, right? Because what's our destiny? Our destiny is to be like who? Like Christ, right? And so he is the way, the truth, and the life, right? So I need to have him, the image of him, and I need to have him as my model before me at all times. And I need to be convicted that that is actually the way. All right. And so if you're sort of narrowing down what you want, if you needed like a single like sentence, it's the conviction that Jesus is the way, the truth, the life. Okay. All right. I actually already said this. I don't know that I have anything else I want to add. Okay. All right. Anything about the motivation of mental prayer before we get into like, okay, how do you do this? Yeah, on a natural level, it is. It's like recalling, yeah, recalling like, okay, no, I would not say that's wrong. I would just say on a natural level, being recollecting, like recalling things that happened. That's true. I just meant it on a supernatural level. No, you were not totally off. I sort of bait and switched on you. Yes.
Mental prayer, point of it is to form convictions that will change your heart's desire. Ultimately, ultimately.
Yes. Yes. Exactly. Like if there's one thing you take home, like that, take that home with you. That is the one thing you need to take home. All right. Any other questions? Yes.
Following up, you said, that's the part about being forming convictions. How do you begin to know what to ask to form convictions about?
Yeah. So we'll talk a little bit about this, but essentially it depends on what you're meditating on. Like I'm going to suggest if you don't know what to meditate on, like start in the Gospels, and I'm going to say start with Mark because it's one that you don't have to necessarily get caught up in a whole lot of details, and Jesus is moving the whole time. And what becomes very obvious, right, is that as you begin to, you pick a gospel passage, and that's going to be what you meditate on. And when you do that, um, it's going to be very clear that there's something in there that uh, in some way, like God is ready to give to you, right? And again, remember like the example I used last week, or where we talked about, okay, like those events that really happened, Jesus was really there, and you were really there with him, um, because he's God, and so expect something to come, right? Expect God's providence. Like, don't. Oftentimes we get like, I don't know, we're looking for like the perfect meditation material, and we get stuck, right? And I would say like just dive into the Gospels to start. Um, or one of the New Testament letters. But I think the Gospels are the easiest, uh, just because they sort of lend themselves. If you do get stuck, we'll talk about this a little bit, from sort of hopping back and forth between what I'll call meditation and contemplation, and I'll make that clear in just a minute. What the difference is. All right. Anything else? Okay. So how do you start? All right. So there's sort of what I will call like remote preparation. It is a really good idea um, to pray first thing in the morning. All right. So the first thing you do, just because, and again, I'm not saying it's a hard and fast rule, but for most people, it just seems to be that is the best time to pray because it often will get squeezed out during the day. Um, and so the night before, it's a good idea to read whatever you're planning to use as your meditation material. and just read it slowly. If it's okay, I'm going to read tomorrow's gospel. And so I read it the night before and I just kind of sit with it for a second. I don't necessarily have to do much with it. I just want to I just want it to be ruminating overnight and percolating it kind of in my spirit. Okay. So night before, spend 2 minutes reading, right? And that sometimes is a good time. Like you're like, okay, like, you know, I just read this like, 2 weeks ago. Maybe I'm gonna move to something different, right? Where you're just like, okay, this makes sense. What you don't want to do is get into the day, like when you're sitting down and meditating, you're like, I don't know what I'm doing, or yeah, I don't like this, or so that's just sort of all the remote preparation that there sort of is, right? The immediate preparation is again, like think of the road to Emmaus, right? So the first thing is like pray in a position where you're like you can be attentive, right? You don't necessarily have to pray on your knees because sometimes being on your knees for extended period of time not that comfortable. You want to pray in a receptive position, probably not laying in your bed, but also you don't necessarily have to be uncomfortable or some people have a specific like chair they pray in because this is like power of association, right? Like it knows like I go into that chair and it's time to pray, right? Um, so uh, you do this. So then the first thing you want to do is acknowledge God's, yes. Yes. Yeah. Yeah. And people like have prayer chairs and prayer tables with, they'll light a candle, for example, before they pray. It's sort of like just letting themselves remind themselves. You all know, like, I think we've talked about this before, like a candle, like, the shape of the flame, right? But what it is, I know April knows this because I've told her before. Have you ever looked at the shape of a flame on a candle? What does it look like? What does it look like? It looks like a tongue of fire, right? So like that's why they're like candles are in churches, right? Like because it's a tongue of fire. So even just lighting a candle, right? Like that's what I mean. You get in a habit of like you begin to see like, wow, like God has made this really easy for us to be aware of his presence. Okay, so put yourself in God's presence, right? So you can do that sort of intellectually. You can sort of slowly say an Our Father. You can just say, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Uh, I know you're always with me, but now I'm attentive to you. I'm paying attention to you. And then you want to make acts of faith, hope, and charity, right? And what that simply just is, I believe that you are one God, Father, Son, Holy Spirit. I believe your divine Son. Again, you can have your own. I believe your divine Son became man and died for our sins and sent the Holy Spirit. Uh, for the free of whatever you want to say, right? Well, I mean, it could be an act of like because what you're doing again, right? Forming the conviction that those things are true, right? That not just that I believe that like Jesus rose from the dead, like I believe Jesus rose from the dead for me. And then the same thing, with hope and charity, make an act of hope. I believe that, and hope that you will save me. I know that you will provide everything I need. Act of charity. God, I love you above all things. Make me love you more. All right. Um, and then now that you've spoken to God and reminded yourself who he is, now remind yourself who you are. Right. So an act of humility and an act of contrition, right? So just understanding like I know who I truly am, a fugitive from hell, and yet you come to me, right? So I want to be in this perfect position of humility and reception. Again, it's not a flagellating session or something. It's just again reminding yourself like that what is going on is practically unbelievable that the God of the universe would come and talk to you personally, right? Um, and normally, then the next thing you do is ask for the Holy Spirit, the grace of the Holy Spirit, to guide you through the meditation. What I found particularly helpful, you can use your imagination to do this. What I found particularly helpful is I speak to Jesus and say, I'm going into my inner room that you have built for me, where only you are allowed. And we go into the inner room, and I envision myself alone with Jesus. All right, whatever it takes to sort of just lock yourself in.
This is, prayer of life.
Yeah, this is the like. So now you're asking him, okay, like it's time. Like I want you to guide me. And you don't necessarily have to like what I just suggested. You could do it at any point, right? Like especially, I found it if you will find that you'll get to a certain point where this might take you like 10 minutes. I don't know if you ever had that experience where it's just like I can't get into it, right? And I found the inner room because Jesus said we all have one. It actually helps me get into it more. So I may bump that up when I need it. Um, and then each time you go into prayer, and this is why it's important to sort of think about what you read the night before and having a plan. Like ask God for what you want, right? Like what do you want from this? Like remember, like that first interaction where Jesus with the apostles, what's the first question he asked them? What do you want? Right? Like don't be afraid to tell God what you want. Yes. You typically do that at the end. I mean, gratitude can come at any point, but typically at the end, you will and you could even in a certain sense, like as your act of faith, you could say, like, I know you hear me, you always hear me. Thank you, uh, for listening to me or whatever. Yes, Mark.
What if you don't know what you? That's really great.
Yeah, I mean, well, think about for a second, like, why are you even there? I mean, it can be just as simple as like, I want to know you better, right? Like, give me the grace to know you better, or give me the grace to be convicted about why I'm here. Yeah, and any of those things, like it doesn't have to be that like I don't mean it doesn't necessarily have to be specific. Like, I'm hoping to get an answer on, who's gonna win the Super Bowl or something, right? Like it can be very very generic. But you should always ask for an increase in love of God, right? Because that's ultimately what you're going for. Yes, Abe. Yeah. So don't well, yeah, just remember this is not meant to be like you have to stick to this, right? Because what often happens when you develop the disposition to do that, like God will often withdraw because he's like, oh, she's not actually praying, she's like going through the motions and she's stuck on a formula to get to me rather than a relationship, right? So in a certain sense, if you have a way to enter into prayer where you're acknowledging that God is present to you and you're sort of acknowledging like your neediness, then that's perfectly fine. And throughout your life, it will like your approach to prayer will change. Right. There are plenty of times where like if I'm particularly distracted and I know it early on, I'll ask my guardian angel to help me like not be distracted. Yes.
I mean, you ain't asking for that possible, but it's like, but it's also like the meditation scripture and all that, but it's just, I don't understand like the logic of that.
Yeah, I mean, I can't necessarily understand the logic either, honestly. I mean, I would guess it's somebody who doesn't understand probably the power of the rosary, and doesn't necessarily see it, um, well, one as a way to honor Our Lady, but also as a way to actually like enter in and meditate on the mysteries, right?
You know, but I just.
Yeah, I'm not sure that I could defend that. Like, Kate, were you going to say something? Okay. All right. Any questions about the preparation? So again, don't get overly stuck on the formula. Yes. Yeah. So essentially, like just tell Jesus what you believe in. Like, what, what specifically do you believe about him? What do you specifically believe about the Father? What specifically do you believe about the Holy Spirit? Again, it doesn't have to be formulaic, you know. And then the same thing, like, what do you hope for? Like, what is it that, what is it that you ultimately want, right? Like, it may just be like, I trust in your promises because that's what you do, right? And the same thing with charity is like, okay, say I love you, like that's good. If you want to say why you love God, that's fine too. But that's the idea, right? Um, it doesn't have to be anything like intricate. Yes.
It's probably might be probably the next part, but how like ask what I wish and desire, but oftentimes God just doesn't answer it right then and there every time we ask. And so how do you go about asking, of course, God to reveal like what's your will for my life, but um, not searching too hard for that answer and like being receptive to like what God has for you at that.
Okay, so ask your question in like 3 slides, and then I'll answer. Like, I think that in like 3 slides, I'll kind of answer it, but then we can go deeper into your question. Okay. All right. So now I'm ready. I'm like ready to pray. Okay. Um, all I will say is, again, it's not a formula, but don't skip it either. Like, because again, like think about like what you're partially trying to do is like make God more real to you, right? This is how you approach people, right? Like in a certain sense, right? Like you don't, there's nothing worse than like somebody who just starts talking to you about something like the minute you walk up, right? You're like, wait a second, I'm like, just this is awkward and weird, and like, so again, God can handle it. Don't get me wrong, but we're again trying to, I think I talked about this last week. Like at a certain point, all of a sudden you realize there's a real person talking to me, right? And so like personal things, the way we approach things actually help us with that, right? God doesn't need this, we do. Okay. All right. So now we get into the meat of the meditation. All right. And then we're going to talk about a couple of different ways to do this, but I want to give this sort of outline first. So the first thing, again, it starts sort of in the head, right? It starts with sort of ruminating on the truth, whatever truth it is we're meditating on, or whatever passage we're meditating on. And what we want to do is start to form convictions about whatever it is, right? About the importance of it, about how it's integral to our life, how how we should desire it, how we want to desire it, all those things, right? And in the midst of that, right, as we begin, and then what we want to do is when we have this conviction, we want to then take and sort of shine the light on ourselves to see where we are with it. Okay, to see where we are in actually living from that conviction or living from that truth. All right. And again, be honest with God, because he already knows. But if we hide, then we're not going to get the graces we need, right? So just be honest. Like I said, I don't desire to forgive people. Make me that kind of person. That's how you approach God. He already knows that. And so I take the point and I go, okay, like how have I lived on this point? And let's say like, yeah, like actually I actually done pretty well with this, right? Well, again, what do? Well, now we make affection towards God. We thank him, right? We thank him for either making us that's relatively easy, or thanking, for whatever, thanking for that time back then when I learned that lying was always bad or whatever. But whatever we find there, right? Now we want to go to God with them. Okay. And we want to talk to him, right, about those things. So sometimes it's, we realize, okay, like actually that's pretty bad, right? So we make an act of contrition, and we, express sorrow for it. We ask God to forgive us. We ask him then to give us the strength to not do that anymore, and so forth and so on. Okay, so whatever it sort of moves us towards is sort of what we go, right? And the reason why I have those starred, right, is ultimately those are the most important parts of the prayer, because that's where our heart's beginning to be formed. Okay, and ultimately what you want to do is when you move, right, you want to move and you want to unite your heart with God, right? And that's how you grow. right? That's how you grow spiritually. And in the midst of that, again, with my idea of sort of where petitions fit in, right? Beg God for what you need, right? And it may be totally different from what you were asking for at the beginning. You might be like, okay, like I shouldn't have asked for that. That I'm not ready for that. I didn't need that. Oh, actually, that's not good. Whatever. And again, that's okay, because what God is doing is renewing your mind to show you, like, not only what is good, but what is good for you, right? And we have to be convicted of that. All right. So again, not anything overly complicated, right? But again, what will happen often, though, this again isn't necessarily linear, and this will happen several times. This sort of process, right, where all of a sudden, we'll sort of consider it, we'll make our acts, and then it'll just kind of dry up on us. Right? That's time. That means it's time to go back to go back to the text and sort of move on. And again, when I show an example in a second, that'll make sense. But again, like all of these elements will be sort of present in your, like, the body of your meditation. Okay. All right. All right. So I want to give this example, and then hopefully this will answer your question. All right. So this is kind of long. It's 2 slides, but it's definitely worth sort of studying. Okay. So last week, Parker, I think it was you that asked about like imagination versus, sort of discursive. Yeah. So St. Ignatius has a very specific way of teaching those two things. So he calls contemplation when we use our imagination, and meditation when we just discursively, and it's discursively sort of go from, one thing to the next, or kind of grasp on the principles rather than activity. And so what I want to do is give an example of both, because your prayer will sort of, again, from time to time, will switch from one to the other. And so what I want to do is sort of help you, because we tend to gravitate towards one or the other, right? So, like, for me personally, I tend to be a little more heady. So, like, meditating on some principle is way easier for me. But then I get locked, and what happens is stuff stays in my head, right? And so I have to go, oh yeah, like, it's time to, like, I actually have to sort of experience, and that's where your imagination comes in. So I want to sort of show you how to do both. Okay. Yes.
How, like,
Yeah, we'll talk more about this when we talk about discernment of spirits next time we meet. But I mean, they can certainly get access to your memory, your imagination, and dreams. Yes. Okay, so this is Saint Therese. Okay, and this is from a diary of a soul. Wait, no, that's not story. Yeah, story of the soul. Sorry. And so anyway, so we'll talk about what she's doing here. So she starts and she says, "I desire to be your spouse, to be a Carmelite. Should this not?" So what is going on interiorly is she has this desire to do about 1,000 different things for God. All right, so she's like, "Well, I'm going to be your spouse. I'm going to be a Carmelite. Isn't that enough?" And she's like, "I feel all these other vocations. I feel the vocation of warrior, apostle, doctor, martyr. Finally, I feel the need and desire of carrying out the most heroic deeds for you, O Jesus. How can I realize the poor desires of my poor little soul?" Okay, so she has these desires, and so she takes them into her time of meditation. And she says, "During my meditation, my desires caused me a veritable martyrdom." So she's struggling with them, right? Like they're actually taking a toll on her. And I open the epistles of St. Paul to find some answer. Chapters 12 and 13 of the first epistle to the Corinthians fell under my eyes. Chapter 12 is what was in the second reading of Mass today. I read there in the first of these chapters that all cannot be apostles, prophets, doctors, etc. That the church is composed of different members, and that the eye cannot be the hand at one and the same time. The answer was clear, but it did not fulfill my desires and gave me no peace. Right, so God answered her. Right, so this is honesty. Right, this is honesty in prayer. Right, God answered her question. Like, she's like, I want to be all these things. Like, too bad, you can't be. Right. And she's like, no, like I'm not satisfied with that. I have no peace on that. Right. But notice what she does. She doesn't pout about it. Right. So without being discouraged, I continued my reading. And this sentence consoled me. So it's precisely because she's like, I know God won't leave me here. She goes back in, right? No discouragement. Yet strive after the better gifts, and I point out to you yet a more excellent way. And the apostle explains how all the most perfect gifts are nothing without love. That charity is the excellent way that leads most surely to God. I finally had rest. Charity gave me the key to my vocation. I understood that if the church had a body composed of different members, the most necessary and most noble of all could not be lacking to it. And so I understood that the church had a heart and that this heart is burning with love. I understood that it was love alone that made the church's members act, that if love ever became extinct, apostles would not preach the gospel and martyrs would not shed their blood. I understood that love comprised all vocations. The love was everything, that it embraced all times. By the way, I didn't put caps in here. This is actually uh, in her own writing, that it embraced all times and places in a word, that it was eternal. Then in the excess of my delirious joy, I cried out, Jesus, my love, my vocation, at last I have found it. My vocation is love. Yes, I found my place in the church. I shall be loved. Thus I shall be everything. Okay, so if you've ever read like Saint Therese and you're like, well, she's talking about her vocation is love, you're like, that's ridiculous. What? And now you know what it actually means, right? So now ask your question if that didn't answer it about like, don't be discouraged and just keep going back at God, right? Because somewhere in there, like he's put that desire on your heart, you might have twisted it up a little bit, but he's going to untwist it, right? And so what we tend to do, right? Like I know there's plenty of times in my life where I'm like, I'll sulk to God. I'll be like, well, I thought you wanted this. And I'm like, and I'll stop talking to him about it, right? I'm like, oh, well, fine, I'll take this, right? And he's like, don't do that. Like, that's not what she did, right? She's like, no, like, no discouragement. I don't want this. This didn't solve the problem, but he told me to keep knocking, so I'm going to keep knocking, right? Like, persistence is the thing, right? And so he really means that, right? And so when you're not getting an answer, keep asking, right? Until you get an answer, right? Don't stop because you're like, well, I think he said no because I'm not hearing anything. Keep knocking, keep going, all right? So this is his example of meditation, right? Like that was all sort of like principles and ideas, right? She's reading, chapter 12 was talking about the spiritual gifts and the vocations in the church, and then moves to chapter 13 where it says, all those things are going to pass away. The only thing left will be love, right? So that's an example of like what that kind of looks like, right? And so there's a little bit of dialogue in there between her and God. But notice like what happens to her is she has one conviction and God flips it on her. Right? And she's convicted she wants to be something great. And he's like, well, yeah, that's a good conviction, but it needs to be untwisted. I need to put it on the place it's supposed to be. Right. So that's the idea of what he would call meditation. Right. And again, do that if you get stuck, then what you do is do the other way, which is use your imagination. All right, and this is Saint Jane Frances de Chantal. This is from her biography. When she was a widow caring for her little children, would read a gospel passage carefully. Next, she would picture the scene with elaborate care. Okay, so when I say use your imagination, it isn't just like make a picture in your mind of it. Like put yourself there. What do you see? What do you hear? What do you smell? What, like all of those things. All right. And remember, this is not just some imaginative musing. You were really there, right? You were really there because Christ had you in mind. And so invoke all of your imagination. In fact, if you ever seen the spiritual exercises of St. Ignatius, he has one meditation very specifically on the incarnation, where he tells you to go into the cave, into the stable where Jesus is born. And he's like, okay, what does it smell like? Like, you could kind of imagine what that smells like, right? Like, what does the hay feel like? Like, put yourself there. And okay, why do you do that? Well, one, it's easy to pray. But now you're using all of your faculties and they're being healed. And it's also leaving an imprint on you, right? And this is what happened to St. Jane Frances de Chantal. She says, okay, with elaborate care, noting Christ, the crowd, the disciples, the centurion in the back, in the foreground, and would then listen to his act of faith. She would study his expressions and the reactions of the crowd, ponder his words and their meaning, and the imaginative seeing that she had composed. And here was her backcloth or her background. Okay, so in this like setting, what you want to do is use your imagination to have a face-to-face encounter with Jesus. All right, so put yourself in the scene, but your direction really is going to be at Jesus. Okay, so ultimately, what you want to come around to is, what is Jesus doing? What's being done to Jesus? Who's doing it? What is he doing? Because again, he is the way, the truth, and the life. Okay. You will find initially, there's actually a way to sort of evaluate how well you're training your imagination. When you can actually begin to smell, that's when you know you're good at this, right? Smelling is the hardest one. Why are you looking at me like that, Victor? When you can imagine what it smells like. Think about that. Like I could tell you to imagine, I don't know, like, have you ever been to Hawaii? Okay, so you could probably like imagine it, right? Okay, so like, but what does it smell like? You can imagine what it sees, yeah, but maybe Hawaii smells a little different.
Like, what does it smell like? It smells weird.
I don't know. I'm just, I have no idea. I've never been to Hawaii. I have no idea. But what I'm saying, oh, I'm sure it smells like, yeah. So, and then the point is, right? Like, in a certain sense, when things begin to happen, it'll trigger your memories of them, right? Like, like a certain sound or something, and you're like, oh, that reminds me of when like the centurion was approaching Christ. So again, like, know this isn't your arsenal, and there is going to be a point in your growth where it won't work, though, I promise. Because what happens is called the dark night of the senses. God takes away your ability to use your imagination because he wants to purify it. So you will spend less time in the dark night of the senses if you master this. I will tell you that right away because it'll be more under your control. Yes. So, but anyway, like, know this is a tool in your arsenal, and it's actually pretty powerful, right? Yes. No, so you go through it, let's call the dark night of the senses and then the dark night of the spirit. So the dark night of the senses is essentially like, well, it's sort of what it is. Like you don't feel like praying. You can't use your memory and imagination, like they're just not working. And if that happens to you, the first and most important thing is to thank God for it, right? Even though it's super unpleasant. And then again, the key, right, always is not just to do God's will, but to love it. So tell him how much you love it. Tell him how much you love how dry your prayer is, right? I mean, some people, yeah, like God doesn't, again, he doesn't do everything the same way, but the ordinary way includes that. So like, yeah, one of the keys is like, because that makes you docile to what he's doing and it makes the purification easier. And if you don't love it, what do? You ask for the grace to love it, right? Like, but oh yeah, like I think 50 plus years. So she heard Christ's voice very distinctly tell her about her vocation, and she never heard his voice again. Yes.
Like, what can you do, like, meditate, when you're not able to meditate?
Well, I mean, try the discursion, like the actual meditative way, right? But there'll be a period where that doesn't work either. And then you're basically back at the beginning of like continually making acts of faith, hope, and love, right? Because at a certain point in your spiritual life, those all have to be strengthened, right? And they're usually strengthened in darkness. And that's when they become more meaningful, right? Because you're like, God, I don't see you. I don't hear you. this is so dry and so dull, and yet for some reason I keep coming back. Like I know you're calling me. That's an act of faith, right? And I know you're doing something. That's an act of hope. And I actually love what you're doing to me because you're making me like your son. That's an act of love. So yeah, there's just a point again, like in the growth that's perfectly normal, even though a lot of people are like, God's rejecting me. That's not. That's why St. John of the Cross is so important, because it kind of explains it all. Okay, any other questions on those sort of two? Again, I hesitate to call them methods, but two approaches. Yes,
Symbols didn't say anything. How do you know that symbols and actions are not? I get very left brain logical with it, and I think it's one right brain.
yeah, I would say, but judge it by its fruits, right? Like, what is it? What did it do to you when you heard St. Joseph talk to you, right? Like personally, I'm not a fan of people like telling me that. I just like there's always going to be like the skeptic in me, like because that's actually like a good spiritual director will be like if you told me that as spiritual direction, I'd be like that didn't happen, just to see what you would say and do, right? Um, so like extraordinary phenomenon like that, like if you're going to tell someone about it, you can just say, you know, I think I heard in prayer this, right? Because it's the humble way to do it, right? But I would say if it happens to you personally, like what's the fruit from it? Like because chances are if Our Lady speaks to you or St. Joseph speaks to you, like it's gonna like with it, there's gonna be like the sort of the whiff of sanctity. There's gonna be peace that comes with it, like all of those things, right? Um, and I mean, if he tells you to go jump off a bridge, you're like, okay, that wasn't St. Joseph. Um, but he tells you, go give Andrew a hug, and he's like, you're like, oh, okay, that was probably St. Joseph.
Still, shadows until after.
Yeah, and that's like I don't necessarily have a problem with someone sharing that, right? Because that's like an extraordinary, like to build other people up. But in the ordinary course of prayer, right? Like I would say, unless there's a good reason, don't share the nitty gritty details of it.
But that would be like a legitimate thing.
To share that, I think so, yeah, because it's gonna like think about like, were you edified by that?
Well, I was sort of met with like the steps, like, well, did St. Joseph really say that? Or did Mary really say that? But I could see the fruit of it. There was definitely a peace, healing aspect to it. But there's left brain thinking about it.
Yeah, I mean, by the same token, when someone shares it with you direct, like, don't always play the skeptic, right? Like, be okay. Like, I believe that can happen. I believe it does happen. I don't see any reason why it didn't, right? Like, um, so yeah, I think I would. All right. So the question is, what comes after the dark night of the senses? It would be the dark night of the spirit. So that's where you essentially your intellect and will do not work in prayer very well. It normally manifests in like I can't for some reason like I can't connect thoughts. Um, I sit and I try to go from like one thing to the next, and I'm just like stuck.
Tell if that's not just like can't focus that.
Yeah. So over time, like, yeah, yeah. So
I know, I don't think I know. I'm like, but like,
yes, yeah. So I mean, it normally isn't like a one-time thing, right?
Yeah.
Like, and it also usually it happens at a stage of prayer, like where you're pretty far along, and you begin to know, okay, like I know how to pray now. This isn't just like, okay, this is an extended period of distraction. This isn't like I know how to pray. I know what praying looks like. This is why he does it later in prayer, right? And you're like, okay, this is clear. That's why it's important to know like the stages, right? Because you could easily go, yeah, I need to just double down and focus better, and then you're just trying, and he's like, stop trying. So yeah, I think once you get there, like you'll know it. And that's like true in a lot of prayer things. Actually, it's like when you get like, because people ask, like, what's contemplation like? You're like, well, if you have to ask, like, you haven't experienced it yet because you'll know it when you see it, right? Yes, Park.
But what I read, I thought there was like 3 nights. It was really just like one long night where it was like evening, midnight, like dawn.
Yeah, so sometimes, so in his poem, that's how he puts it, right? And then when he explains it, sometimes there's a respite in between. Um, but I think he really like he'll call them like the active night of the senses. I think it's active night, passive night, and then it's actually 4 of them. So it's like active night of the senses, passive night of the senses, active night of the spirit, passive night of the spirit.
Okay.
And I think it's each of the watches
Like
of the night.
what's being done.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. And so we sort of by default kind of start at the active night of the senses where like you start early on, you're like, you have to mortify yourself a lot in order to grow in prayer.
But that's what most of us.
I mean, I don't know, like, but that's where everyone starts, right? Like that's, when you're at the stage of sort of mortification, that's where you start. Once you've sort of, and we'll talk more about this too when we talk about discernment of spirits, but essentially the first like whole step in the thing is, okay, if you have habitual mortal sin, that's the first thing that has to go, right? And then once you get into the stage where you're like, okay, I have habitual venial sin, I hardly ever mortal sin, that's when you really start to grow. But we'll talk more about that when we talk about discernment of spirits. Okay, yes, Patrick. Yes. Yeah, and how long they stayed in it, and like I think Teresa of Avila said she was like in the Dark Knight for like 30 years or something. Like it was a long time. But yeah, I think everyone has to in some way, like God may, I mean, there's probably exceptions, of course, like where God, skips over. If you read like the life of St. Thomas Aquinas, there's a good chance he probably skipped over those things because he was really good at asking for the right things. And because he asked for chastity, most importantly, he was able to, he had that sort of angelic purity that allowed him like nothing else to get in the way of the spiritual growth. So, but in general, yes, Patrick, everybody kind of goes through that.
Where does St. John cross out on stuff? Is it what's the book?
I'm trying to think about which of his books. I think it's Ascent to Mount Carmel, sorry. But I mean, it's sort of all throughout, but I'm pretty sure it's an Ascent to Mount Carmel, I believe. I will look when I get home to be sure, and I'll throw it in the group chat. But okay, so all right, we've come to so we're now sort of moving. So my recommendation is to pray for X amount of time. Like so it has a beginning and an end, just like you would schedule a meeting, right? So like, and I'm going to recommend like to begin, if it's not habitual yet, start with 15 minutes. All right. And then slowly over time, add 5 minutes to where you're praying for doing a meditation for 30 minutes a day is about sort of what your goal is. Okay. So, you're moving towards like, okay, the end time. So how do you sort of wrap it up? All right. To meditate on what we read helps us to make it our own by confronting it with ourselves. Okay. Sort of all we talked about. It is a question of acting truthfully in order to come into the light. Lord, what do you want me to do? Okay. So as you're concluding, what you want to do is leave your prayer time with a resolution, a particular resolution. Okay. That's essentially what this is telling us to do, right? Like, okay, Lord, you've touched me. Okay. What do I need to do differently from this point forward? What do you want me to do today so that I can now take the grace you've given me and carry it like forth so that it becomes mine? So normally, okay, so I'm just going to give you a vocabulary word. It's a big sort of word, but it doesn't, just so when you begin to read either St. Ignatius or St. John of the Cross, a colloquy is just when I just sit and talk to God. Okay. And within that colloquy, at the end of prayer, you want to make an act of thanksgiving for the graces you've received. You want to make a resolution. You want to, before God, promise to fulfill the resolution. Right. And with all things that you promise that God asks of you, he's also giving you the grace to fulfill it. But make sure you ask for the grace anyway. And then what I would suggest, as again, this comes from St. Ignatius, spend 2 or 3 minutes looking back at your prayer and evaluating how you prayed. Okay. If you want to take a picture of this, this is like what I would call a prayer examine. Now, at any given point, you're not gonna answer all 6 of these questions. Just pick one. All right. And what you're trying to do is just to make sure, like in reviewing, one, that you gathered all the grace that was there. You didn't miss something or have to come back. And you also want to take note of something that was kind of persistent there that it was like sort of background noise. And you're like, I don't know really what that was. But I want to be aware of it. Yes, Patrick.
Prayer afterwards, because I treat prayer like a conversation, like a relationship, like you also, when you know, when you're ready, with you, like time to find afterwards. How that time was.
Yeah. So, but if you look at these, it's not that, right? It's more of what am I taking with me? Right. So, I mean, the analogy is good. I get it. But the only thing I would say is what I think is important is ultimately like what you want to do is make note of like things that happened because what you're trying to do is connect them later on, right? So I think that's why St. Ignatius says to do that. And I mean, there's enough saints that did that kind of stuff that I feel comfortable recommending it. And I've seen it in my own life very often. What I'll do, like to skip to the journaling part, right? Like when I say journaling, like it's probably not a good example to use St. Faustina because hers is like meant for other people to read and it's like, really beautiful. What I'm suggesting is writing down like 1 or 2 themes of what your prayer was about. And just having it in a place, right? And then at a certain point, probably a week later, I would go back and just look at those. Right. And what you begin to see as you do this, you begin to see, oh, like there was something there that God was telling me, and now I see it because it's connecting the dots. All right. Again, this doesn't need to be complicated. It doesn't need to be written as if you're going to be the next Saint Faustina. But I would suggest it definitely works. And then as if you do get a spiritual director, it also helps tremendously to sort of review what's going on with your spiritual director. Yes.
Remember like the times I had like just like kind of like remembering like the
I can appreciate what you're saying, but I mean it makes sense to me in that regard. That's why I don't necessarily think you should journal while you're praying for that reason, because it's like, I'm talking to you, hold on, let me write this down, right? But I do think to me it's the same thing with like it's more or less the same thing as if, I had a meaningful conversation with you and like a half hour later I'm just reviewing it in my head, right? Like how it went, right? Because, it's I care what you said and think, and I need to think more about it or whatever. So I'm just suggesting it's just easier if you write it down. And that's why I don't think it needs to be overly complicated. Okay. So sometimes one of those, like answering one of those questions, writing it down is helpful. Sometimes not. And if you don't find it helpful, don't do it. Like don't keep pounding your head against the wall. It's just from my perspective, I've found that, especially at certain times, to be particularly helpful to me. Okay, last slide. All right, so what I am suggesting and asking of all of you is to commit to these 3 things for the rest of the semester. What was that part?
Oh,
Yeah, well, this is God telling you, right? Like,
yeah.
yeah. Yeah, so a morning offering. So we do lots of things during the day, right? And there's a thing called a virtual intention, right? And what that just simply means is I don't have to intend every single thing I do to give it to God. I can do what's called a virtual intention where I just give him everything and he knows that I'm offering it up to him, right? And you can renew that throughout the day. It's a good idea too. But you want to offer your day to God, right? Thank him for preserving you through the night. Um, and we take for granted how sleeping at night used to be really dangerous and we take all of that for granted. Just thank him, you know, thank him for the gift of a new day. If you have anything particular going on that day that's important, like offer it to him, ask for his grace. That's a morning offering. Daily meditation, 15 minutes. And then at the end, and we're going to talk more about what an examen looks like shortly, but the short and sweet is to take 5 to 10 minutes at the end of the day, looking back over the day to see what God was doing. Okay, so asking him to show you what he was doing in different periods throughout the day, whatever sort of pops up at you, right? And you just want to start with gratitude and you just want to look at it. It's a little different from an examination of conscience, right? Where your examination of conscience is looking, okay, what did I do wrong? This is more like from the other perspective, what was God doing? Yeah, I mean, examination of conscience is a good thing, right? Like, don't get me wrong. And it may just be like, of course, if you go, yeah, God, you gave me the grace to deal with Michael, and I didn't, and I totally blew it, and I'm sorry for that, right? Like, it's just natural, sort of.
I feel like I kind of.
Yeah, that's a perfect way to do it, right? So, but if you can first start with, okay, what were you doing, God? Not what did I do or what did I do wrong? That's ultimately what you want to do. Because what you want to begin to do, right? What that helps you to do, and we'll talk more about this when we cover it. It helps you to what you're doing is, you're sort of like armchair quarterbacking, looking back at God's providence, right? And what you're trying to learn how to do is recognize His providence in the moment, right? And that's ultimately like the purpose of the exam. Okay, all right. Any questions? That's the last slide. Yes, Patrick. I can. Yeah, I certainly can. I'll see where it sort of fits in, but yeah, definitely.
I have like parts that I.
Mhm. Oh, that's really generous of you. I mean, I don't think there's anything. I didn't look, but I don't think there's anything here. Yeah. 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 Thank you for doing that. Somebody else had their hand up. Why is life spelled like that? No. Oh, I think because it's Latin.
Oh,
Yeah, I think it's just that's all. Usually, that answer is almost always it's Latin. If it sounds weird, it's Latin. Yes, Patrick. I mean, certainly, like St. John of the Cross is really good. There is what is the title of that book? The author's name is Edward Lean. Um, it's called Progress Through Mental Prayer. To me, that's the best book like on prayer out there. Trying to think about what I mean. I could give you like a whole list of them.
There's a book that I read, it's called Camino. It's like 500 or 600 pages.
I don't know if it's helps to mental prayer, but it's like some little phrases you just read and you like might help.
Yeah, I mean, I'm sure they are, like. Okay, anybody, anything else? You're welcome. Anyone who wants to pray though? Can't get out of here without praying.